In Jesus' most famous sermon, he sketched out an imagination for a new type of community, a new type of kingdom, it's sometimes called, a new type of humanity, a new creation, perhaps you might even call it. And partway through a list of things that he imagined would be fundamental to this new community, Jesus said this phrase, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Literally, those who do peace, those who make peace. The word that is used here, this word that we translate peacemakers, actually is where we also get the word poetry from. The makers of peace, the creative workers of peace, that somehow to do the type of peace that Jesus is imagining, somehow to make that work, will require levels of creativity, imagination, and something profound from those of us who join him in this kingdom. Evidently, Jesus imagined that for peace to become a reality in our world and in our communities, it was going to take some creativity from us. However, this was before we invented the internet and became what journalist David Patrikaros calls homo digitalis. Have you ever thought about how you would do without the internet? How would your life work without the internet? Like, as much as we try and be unplugged, I was organizing some insurance the other day there, and I got a few questions, and I thought to myself, let me not try and solve this on the internet. I'll call a real person. And I called a real person who, as the conversation went on, I realized they were just on the internet. So I'm talking to them, and I can hear them doing this. I go to my doctor. I tell my doctor, I think I know what's wrong with me because I've Googled it. My doctor says, you really shouldn't Google what's wrong with you because the answer is always you're going to die or it's nothing. And so I tell my doctor my symptoms, to which point he does this with his computer screen and Googles my symptoms. You know, so like what's actually going on here? We are hugely, hugely connected. And then in various things that have happened in the last few years, we've seen the power of what happens when individuals on the internet can change the world. With this highly networked, globally connected, and more potent than ever, we truly are homo digitalis. We're connected in ways we never could have imagined being connected before. It gives us access to information and views and perspectives that we never could have imagined before. Rather than sourcing our views on the world from a few places, as not so many years ago was how we did it. You switched on a particular news station and you heard a particular set of news stories fed your way and you made up your mind as the basis of what you heard, what was actually going on. Now we curate our own realities through individual social media interactions. Have you noticed how often social media knows what's going on in the world before the news stories do? That something happens and it makes it to Twitter and Instagram before CNN have even thought about it? And this allows us to interact with the world in ways we'd never imagined. There is, however, a problem, because the algorithms of the internet mean that actually what we end up constructing are echo chambers for ourselves, in which our own pre-existing prejudices are confirmed and solidified. Because as the more and more we use, and you know this already, but the more and more you use the internet learns you. It learns about what you like and what you're interested in and what your political biases are and what your perspectives are, so that when you Google something and I Google something, here's the thing, we don't get the same results. I get results that Google thinks I will like, and you get the results that Google thinks you will like. Which is why we're all shocked at the results of elections nowadays, because our social media, our news feed has been telling us a particular result is coming, and when a different result happens, or when perhaps the same result happens, we're either confirmed in our bias or shocked that what on earth is actually going on out there. Here's the thing about the internet. There's always somebody who agrees with you that's made a YouTube video. The problem is, they could be brilliant, they might be crazy. And YouTube doesn't care. It just knows that you like this sort of stuff. So you keep clicking watch next, and it keeps firing its way through. And we become more and more confirmed in what we think, and that what we think is right. What this does mean is that when we encounter somebody who thinks differently from us, has a view different from our own, processes in ways that we don't, our reaction is more severe now than it's ever been, because increasingly we're less and less exposed to ideas that we don't agree with. This is fascinating, that in a world with more information access than ever, we live in a bigger bubble than we ever have before. You can get through a good chunk of your life never encountering variant ideas. So the irony is that we have all this access to data, but what we get is a failure to be able to listen and critically assess and make our own minds up. We become essentially pawns of something else that's controlling what we see and what we don't see. So the irony of living in a postmodern world is that we know that truth is something apparently we're supposed to question, but we're less better than ever to spot truth when we see it. And this all plays its way out on what I think we should probably start referring to as the unsocial media. The one thing we know for true about social media is that it's not very social, right? We get in front of our keyboards or on our phones or with our particular apps, and all of a sudden we encounter a variant view in the form of a picture or a meme or 140 characters, and we forget that there's a real human out there somewhere who's expressing their own particular ideas, and we take on a new identity, an identity I like to refer to as the keyboard warrior. That from my keyboard I will now correct the world. From this app I will put everyone right. And what we end up doing is we kind of sort of pour out our ideas into this social world and so on and so forth. We see this develop into one person saying one thing and one person saying another thing. And you find yourself going, man, I didn't realize my friend was such a jerk. Let me correct him now online. And now you guys are nicer. You don't say it so like that. But think about how often you've seen things on a friend's social media post and you've thought, goodness, I really thought I liked that person. But I can't believe that they would think this. And we see friendships being affected by the things that we're posting online. And then friendships further affected by the way that we speak to one another online. It seems like there's a good rule of thumb, just as a brief interruption on our start this morning. A good rule of thumb is if you wouldn't say it in person, don't say it online. But that seems to be easily forgotten, right? And we end up in conflict with people we know and don't know. Have you ever typed out something on the internet? And this is not just a young person phenomena, by the way. Have you ever typed something out on the internet and just about before you were about to click send thought, maybe I don't want this over the whole world. Maybe I don't want this discovered for everyone. I had to fill out one of those forms that British people have to do to go to the States. That sentence just crash landed on me right there. Let me step back over here and try it again. I'm very nervous about going to the America, apparently. So I had to fill out one of those forms recently to go to America that British people have to fill out. And there's this new question has appeared on it since the last time I filled out the form was, please supply your social media accounts. Oh yeah. So it's likely I won't be coming back. But it's an interesting that comes to us. If you had to present your social media account and all its comments to someone else, how would we feel about that? But more seriously, it seems that any big issue that goes on in the world is almost immediately polarized online. Social media is really bad at nuance. Have you noticed this? It's really bad at getting into the details. Complex issues are simplified and sides are chosen. So with more knowledge than we could ever have had before, we are more entrenched, more biased, segregated, and bigoted than perhaps ever before. And these cycles of us getting into conflict arguments with people or watching them happen, sometimes you don't need to say anything, you just watch the argument unfold. They're happening at warp speed. And Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers. In a world prior to social media, he called us to think about how we make peace. How do we do peace in a world that seems so beset on being entrenched into opposing positions? How do we, the people of God, figure out what it's like to yearn for peace and to make peace in a world that increasingly seems to think you're either one side or the other and there's no chance of reconciliation? But you see, the central vision of the Bible is that all of creation is one. That every creature in community with every other, living in harmony and security towards the joy and well-being of every other creature. The biblical vision from day one is that God comes to chaos and brings order, that God comes to catastrophe and brings peace. And it seems that human history has often tried to work against that. We seem to like dividing ourselves off into different sort of areas and not having peace, having often the opposite of peace. But the Bible's view is for something more hopeful than that, for something deeper than that. The Hebrew word that we often translate peace is the word shalom. Many of us know this word. And it carries the weight of this vision of everyone somehow living in harmony. And when we say peace, often that kind of means just quiet or calm or a little bit of still before anything else. But shalom is so much deeper than that. It's not simply the absence of fighting or violence or a ceasefire, as we sometimes might talk about peace. But shalom is the presence of God in all of his fullness, putting things right. Walter Brueggemann perhaps explains it better like this. Shalom bears the freight of a dream of God that resists our tendencies to division, hostility, fear, drivenness, and misery. Shalom is the substance of the biblical vision of one community embracing all creation. When I turn on my social media feeds, or flip on the news, or scroll through a newspaper online, I find myself, perhaps as you might, thinking, our world really needs shalom. Our world really needs something deep, something that resists my tendency for division, my tendency for fear. That's a strange thing, isn't it? How often my desire to fight actually comes from my fear. I encounter a view that's different from mine. I encounter an idea that doesn't sit well with my own ideas. And my fear and threatenedness as to my own idea causes me to fight back. And then I come into this biblical vision of shalom, this vision of the presence of God that works against and resists divisiveness. See, because shalom is not some pie-in-the-sky idealism that we just hope for something better. But we see all through the pages of Scripture this dream coming into reality in various places. In creation, we see God bringing ordered fruitfulness into a world of chaos. In communities, we see God directing his communities in ways that work against forces of injustice and exploitation and instead bring about equity and God's peace. And even in our personal existence, we see a constant refrain in the biblical story that calls us to move away from that kind of anxious self-seeking that so many of us are driven by and actually step into a generous, caring form of life. See, because the biblical vision of shalom functions as a firm rejection of values and lifestyles that seek security and well-being in manipulative ways at the expense of another. And whenever we try and do that, it's when we find ourselves in places of conflict. Notice how often our conflicts throughout the world come as a result of us putting ourselves first, of my own values being above the other values. So much violence happens in our world because we're seeking our own security in the face of a threat of someone else. And sometimes we often jump in and talk about this at the point when everyone's fighting. But no fight starts with the fight. The fight starts earlier than that, doesn't it? When an idea is presented, when a conflict happens, and when we hold our lines and say, my position is more important than your position. And peace and shalom breaks down, and the cycles of violence start. Cycles of violence that start often with words, which is why so often the Bible tells us to be careful with our words. But words that cycle into actions, and actions that often cycle into wars, are all part of this breakdown of this beautiful vision that God has, that he might come in and bring shalom in the midst of our divisiveness. And in one sense, it sounds unimpressive to talk about this in a religious context, right? Because every religion, they're all about peace, right? If I had a buck for every time somebody'd said to me, well, religion is just basically about being nice to everyone, right? And no. But I understand also that it kind of, in a lot of religious contexts, sounds very normal to hear us talk about peace in a religious idea. But there's more to it than that. The theorist René Girard, he held in his theorizing about religion and violence, he held that religion was often born from the attempt to deflect violence. And what happens is you have a sequence and cycle of violence happening, and somebody would step in with a religious idea that would guide the conflict away from the violence amongst the group and onto a surrogate, like a scapegoat. So most sacrificial systems are trying to break the cycles of violence that are going on. That if we're not careful, these cycles of violence will essentially destroy each other. So somewhere we've got to put something into the middle of this cycle to stop it happening. And Girard said in his theorizing about religion was that what most religions try and do is they provide a scapegoat in order to do that. The revolutionary aspect of the biblical story is that Jesus, known as he is as the Lord of peace, becomes a peacemaker by creatively absorbing the violence and chaos of the world into himself in his death on a cross. So Christianity has a scapegoat notion to it. But it's not a constantly repeating scapegoat. It's not a constant sacrifice that's rolled out, but it's actually a destruction of the cycle of violence at the very beginning of its story. That Jesus absorbs into himself the violence. Normally what happens is we look at somebody else to project it onto, but Jesus absorbs it into himself. When Paul writes to the Ephesians in chapter 2 of his letter, he says this of Jesus, "For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who were far away and peace to those who were near. For through him, we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household." I wonder if this should be the key text of the internet for today. Imagine if this was the text we looked at before we started our debates. That whatever it is that we're getting involved in, whatever our conflict is we're about to take on, Jesus becomes this theological basis for the church's idea of shalom. That there are always two. There are almost invariably always two sides. And there's invariably always a dividing wall. There's a thing that comes between us that we say, about this particular issue, we're now going to fight. It sneaks in on us sometimes. Sometimes you don't intend to do it. But have you noticed in your own life how destructive things can become to your relationships? That simple relationships, they're almost bound in genes. Relationships between fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters can become broken down because some sort of issue, some sort of dividing wall gets set up. And we decide, let's live on other sides of this and just start to throw things at each other. And this beautiful vision of Jesus that Paul has is that he not only makes two groups one, but he also removes the dividing wall. The shalom of God needs to come into our situations and point out these divisions aren't worth being divided over. And Jesus becomes the model for peace. His saving action on the cross draws together people from far and near. I always love that far and near phrase. Because many of us want to be near. The beautiful thing about Jesus' peace is being near isn't any more advantageous than being far, because Jesus is drawing everyone together under a grace that is not granted by status or worth, but by the peacemaking activity of Jesus. So when Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers," he then models that out in his own situation. That somehow it's not about choosing the right side and bringing the other over to your side, but it's about figuring a way that these sides work together. Making peace requires huge creativity, massive levels of creativity. And in our internet world, it sometimes requires levels of creativity that we might not even think are possible. Paul is writing to a church in Ephesus where the division is between two cultures of people, Jews and Gentiles. And there are more reasons than even in most of the situations we encounter in the modern life to keep Jews and Gentiles apart. In certain streams of Judaism, Jewish men would wake up in the morning and their first prayer was, "Thank God I'm not a Gentile." That's conflict for you, right? And we bring together our areas of conflict in the world today, and we look at them and think no one can ever join that together. But here's Paul talking about how Jesus came and took these two groups of people and brought them together in Christ. So, in one sense, what Jesus also does, and this is important for us, is he sorts out our vertical relationships, if you don't mind me explaining it in that particular way. He sorts out our relationship with God. We have peace with God, is what Paul's often saying about what Jesus has done for us. So that vertical relationship has been corrected. The Lord of peace has ensured that there is shalom between God and his creation. The tension now is between creation itself. And so often what we do within religious contexts is we assume that the tension is between us and God. But the biblical message seems very clear in the New Testament that there is no tension between us and God. The Lord of peace has put all those things aside. He has drawn us together. The problem is now we're together, And the truth is, like, this isn't a Greek phrase, but bag of cats kind of comes to mind sometimes. That I don't know whoever first thought putting cats in a bag was a good idea, but very quickly they decided it was a bad idea, not just for the kind of animal rights reasons, but we're brought together on this beautiful unifying vision of God. We're all gathered from far and near, and we come together, and then we start to realize that, we all love Jesus. It's each other we have a problem with. And that's so often our issue. You've heard many a pastor probably in your life say, I'd be good at this if it wasn't for the people. And most of us say that about our own lives as well. Our street would be so much better if it wasn't for the next door neighbors, right? And this is a constant problem that we struggle with as humans. It's not actually, in our religion as Christians, it's not actually our relationship with God that's problematic. That is sorted and dealt with. It's our relationship with each other. It's the horizontal relationships. It's the people we argue with on the internet. Because the act of Christ on the cross has ironically increased the likelihood of tension. Because now humans who wouldn't normally be together are gathered together into this thing called church. We wouldn't normally be friends. We wouldn't normally occupy the same space. There's all sorts of different reasons why we might not all be in this room together. And yet Christ has brought us together and calls us to be peacemakers. So what we're saying is that peace will disrupt the status quo. This is what true peacemaking always does. We live in our bubble, whether it's an internet algorithm-formed bubble or a bubble that we've made by our own choices, but we live in this bubble. And we're happy with it, and we like the way things are. We do things the way we do things, and we have no complaints. But then we come to church, and we sit next to people who have different political views than us, who have different economic ideas than us, have different theories about how the world works. And we all come in together. And so often our problem in church is we assume that all of that needs to change for us to get on together. But that's not peacemaking. That's just whitewashing. And Jesus didn't say, blessed are the whitewashers. He said, blessed are the peacemakers. And you see, in every context, there will always be the status quo and those outside of it. And the call of the church is to be a third person, the peacemaker, the agent of vision, the prophet, perhaps, as you might want to put it, who will draw us together in our creative ways, that the two somehow become one. For Paul, in the letter to the Romans, the big tense issue of his day surrounded this idea of bringing Jews and Gentiles together into the church. It was very complex because not only were the Jewish people possibly getting up in the morning and saying, thank God I'm not a Gentile, which really doesn't warm you to each other when you then get together, but Jewish food laws and holy days were very, very important to these early Jewish Christians. And the Gentile Christians were coming in. They believed in Jesus. They absolutely confirmed that he was their peace, but they didn't have those food laws and they didn't have those holy days. And this was a problem because they were all mushed in together. And this is difficult when your food laws mean that you're not even really supposed to eat with other people who don't follow your food laws. It's hard when one of the main things that the early Christians did in Rome when they got together was eat together. It kind of doesn't work. People kind of notice if you refuse to touch anything that they've touched. That goes badly in a dinner table situation, when you're like wrapping your hand in the sweater sleeve and passing food to them and then refusing to eat it, and while they're eating their bacon, you're just screwing your face up at them. But this was a grace community, you see. People weren't gathered into the church in Rome by their similarity. They were gathered because Jesus had found them and drawn them together. So after 11 and 12 chapters about grace, Paul starts to deal with really profoundly simple things. Like, this is one of the greatest theological books in the New Testament, is the letter of Romans. Paul talks about some huge landscapes of theology, and then he gets to chapter 14 and starts talking about food. Because peacemaking often requires us to work out in the really small and mundane things of life. In chapter 14, Paul says this: "Therefore, let us stop passing judgment on one another. Instead, make up your mind not to put a stumbling block or obstacle in the way of a brother or sister. I am convinced, being fully persuaded in the Lord Jesus, that nothing is unclean in itself. But if anyone regards something as unclean, then for that person it is unclean. If your brother or sister is distressed because of what you eat, you are no longer acting in love. Do not by your eating destroy someone for whom Christ died. Therefore, do not let what you know is good be spoken of as evil. For the kingdom of God is not a matter of eating and drinking, but of righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit. Because anyone who serves Christ in this way is pleasing to God and receives human approval. Let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification." Now, if you look closely, you see what Paul does here is fascinating. Here's the discussion. Let's put it in comical terms. Do we eat bacon? Do we not eat bacon? Right? This is a problem that hopefully none of you will have in a few minutes' time. This was a huge issue for Paul and the early Christians. For the Jewish people who'd be grown up from their earliest days, you do not eat anything that comes from a pig. For the Gentiles, a pig was a very easy and cheap source of food with no religious obstacles to it. Why would you not eat this? How do you put these people together? What is Paul's opinion on this particular subject? Do you see it in the text? He has no opinion on the subject. He offers no answer to who is right and who is wrong. He sidesteps the issue of camps and positions and sides, and he bypasses polarizing positions. He says nothing of rightness and wrongness. He asks the question, is this worth division or not? Now, for me, this is profoundly insightful, and not many times in my own life have I been able to display this type of wisdom. I don't know about you, but I find myself so easily sucked into my side of the argument. And whereas I might be open and welcoming to the other person, I still have my position, and my position is something that I'm not prepared to give up particularly easily. But somehow Paul does something remarkable. He basically says the argument's not worth having if the argument is going to separate us from being the community of Christ. The church has huge work to do in the world when it comes to peacemaking. We'll talk about that over the next few weeks of this series. But for Paul, it's important that the radical grace of Jesus be evident even in the tiny little inter-community conflicts. It seems to me that the question about peacemaking for Paul comes down to this: is this a hill worth dying on? Because so often our conflicts with others in life, in church, in family, kind of start to take on this approach not dissimilar to what often happens in military conflicts, where somebody decides that a particular piece of land is strategic and we're going to hold it at all costs. And how many people have been broken and destroyed and hurt because somebody chose to hold a position in their church community rather than have an attitude of creative peacemaking. And often what happens then is we start fighting, and the desire to win overwhelms everything else. And it seems to me that when it comes to this issue of who eats what Paul's saying is peacemaking sometimes involves ignoring your own biases. Peacemaking sometimes involves stepping away from your own position. It might even involve you not doing something that you think you could do. Because peacemaking begins by realizing that people are more important than your opinion. Sometimes we've got to step away from the keyboard. We've got to put down the app and ask what best models the work that Jesus started on the cross and in us. When Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers," he's calling those of us to be creative. And the most creative task, I think, that often is required of us is to remember that we're all human and in this together. When Paul begins his letter to the Romans, he uses a phrase that I like to use regularly to remind me of the breadth of the gospel. Grace and peace, Paul says to the Romans. Grace and shalom. The Roman church was a project that took Jews and Gentiles who wouldn't even eat together and put them in the same space. And Paul says grace and peace because that's what they need. They need the grace of Jesus that says you are in this space with no regard for who you are or what your worth or value is. And we need God's peace because everything in us as humans wants to start suggesting that our way is a little bit more important than someone else's way. And why we should always say grace and peace together is because radical grace needs the shalom of God. Because we'll fight it. We'll fight God's radical grace on almost every chance we get. Because everything in us, and this is why we love social media so much, everything in us wants it all to be about me. And peacemaking says it's maybe not all about me. It's maybe about the other. And so Paul says grace and peace because it's this creative tension of the gospel that draws me into an us and asks us to creatively join God in this incredible shalom project. So may you find it in your own life to not sweat the small stuff. May you find it in your own life to identify that many of these hills we want to die on are not worth dying on. May we find the Jesus who brings those who are far and near into his grace. And may his grace and peace draw all of your creativity together that you may be a peace poet, a creative bringer of shalom to your world. And may God's grace and peace